Deep within the Imperial Palace on Terra, in a corridor few are permitted to enter, stand 20 pillars. Each pillar once bore a statue of one of the Emperor's sons, the godlike beings known as Primarchs, who led humanity's greatest armies during the Great Crusade. But 2 of these plinths have stood empty for 10,000 years. The statues that once occupied them were removed, their names struck from every record, their deeds erased from history itself. These are the Lost Primarchs of the Second and 11th Legions, and they represent one of the deepest, most enduring mysteries in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. When Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, walked through the falls of the Kathmandu precinct and gazed upon those vacant plinths, he pondered their absence with a heavy heart. No one spoke of those 2 absent brothers anymore. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations at the time, but now, as the Horus Heresy tore the Imperium apart, Dorn wondered if they had actually been warnings that no one had heeded. What could have happened that was so terrible, so shameful, that even the memory of these Primarchs had to be obliterated? And perhaps most intriguingly, could they still be alive somewhere, hidden away in the darkest corners of the galaxy? The question burns in the minds of lore enthusiasts across the 40k community. While we know the fates of the 18 other Primarchs, some alive, some dead, some lost to the warp or transformed beyond recognition, the 2nd and 11th remain complete enigmas. Games Workshop has deliberately maintained this mystery for decades, leaving only tantalizing fragments of information scattered across novels, codexes, and Forge World publications. These fragments paint a picture that is simultaneously fascinating and frustrating, a jigsaw puzzle with most of its pieces missing and no image on the box to guide us. The Emperor created 20 Primarchs in his gene laboratories, deep beneath the Himalayan mountains during the closing years of the Age of Strife. These were not mere genetically enhanced warriors. Each Primarch was a work of supreme craftsmanship, a being of such power and ability that they seemed like gods made manifest. The Emperor poured aspects of his own essence into these creations, making each one an embodiment of a particular aspect of warfare and leadership. One became the greatest strategist the galaxy had ever known. Another mastered the psychic arts beyond all others. A third became the perfect architect of fortifications. Each was designed to fulfill a specific role in the Emperor's grand plan to reunite humanity and bring order to the chaos-ravaged galaxy. But the Chaos Gods had other plans. As the infant Primarchs gestated in their incubation pods, the ruinous powers struck. They tore a rift in reality itself and scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy like seeds on the wind. The Emperor's carefully laid plans seemed doomed, but he refused to abandon his sons. Over the next several decades of the Great Crusade, the Emperor systematically located and retrieved each of his lost children, bringing them into the fold of the Imperium and placing them at the head of their respective Space Marine legions, or so the story goes. Because somewhere between the scattering of the Primarchs and the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, 2 of the Emperor's sons simply ceased to exist. Not just physically, but historically. An edict of obliteration was issued, also known as Damnatio Memoriae, a formal censure that demanded the complete destruction of all records, icons, symbols, and monuments pertaining to these individuals. This wasn't the treatment given to traitors. When 9 Primarchs turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, they were declared excommunicate traitoris, but their names remained in the records. Their crimes were documented. Their betrayal was known throughout the Imperium. But the 2nd and 11th received a different treatment entirely. They were forgotten, purged, erased as if they had never existed at all. The Lost Primarchs are often referred to by the nicknames the Forgotten and the Purged. These titles appear in various texts, though never with much elaboration. The Forgotten suggests one whose memory has faded away, while the Purged implies active removal, possibly through violent means. Whether these names refer to specific individuals or are interchangeable terms for both Lost Brothers remains unclear. What we do know is that their erasure from Imperial records was so complete that even their brother Primarchs, beings of incredible intellect and eidetic memory, struggled to remember details about them. This wasn't natural forgetfulness. This was something more sinister, more deliberate. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor and one of the most powerful psychers in the galaxy, played a central role in this erasure. Through his immense psychic abilities, Malcador suppressed the memories of those who had known the Lost Primarchs. He reached into the minds of space marines, Imperial officials, and even his fellow Primarchs, burying the truth deep within their subconscious where it could not be easily accessed. The few times Primarchs attempted to speak the names of their lost brothers, Malcador intervened with extreme prejudice. In one recorded instance, when Horus attempted to mention one of the Lost Primarchs by name, Malcador psychically strangled him into silence. The message was clear. This topic was absolutely forbidden, and not even the Emperor's most favoured son was exempt from that prohibition. The real-world explanation for the Lost Primarchs is relatively straightforward, though it adds another layer to the mystery. The concept was inspired by the Lost Legions of ancient Rome. The Roman military had numbered their legions, and historical records show that certain legion numbers disappeared from the rolls without explanation. Whether these legions were destroyed, disbanded, or simply renumbered remains a matter of scholarly debate. Games Workshop incorporated this historical mystery into their fictional universe as a deliberate homage and as a storytelling device. Rick Priestley, one of the original creators of Warhammer 40,000, initially conceived the Lost Legions as blank spaces that players could fill with their own custom chapters and invented backstories. This would allow hobbyists to create their own Space Marine forces with unique histories and characteristics, while still fitting within the established lore. However, as the Horus Heresy series expanded and the timeline of the Great Crusade became more detailed and codified, the Lost Primarchs evolved into something more than simple placeholders. They became integral parts of the narrative, mysterious figures whose absence shaped the actions and psychology of their brother Primarchs. The mystery deepened, and with each new novel that touched upon them, fans received just enough information to fuel speculation without ever coming close to a definitive answer. This deliberate ambiguity serves multiple purposes. It maintains a sense of ancient mystery in the universe, suggesting that even the comprehensive records of the Imperium have gaps and secrets. It acknowledges that history is written by the victors, and that uncomfortable truths can be buried by those with sufficient power, and practically it allows Games Workshop to keep options open, never fully committing to an explanation that might limit future storytelling possibilities. The Lost Primarchs can be whatever the narrative needs them to be, appearing in illusions and half-remembered conversations but never fully manifesting on the page. Yet despite this intentional vagueness, or perhaps because of it, the question remains tantalizingly open. Are the Lost Primarchs truly dead? Were they executed for their failures or transgressions? Could they have been imprisoned somewhere, locked away in stasis or buried in the deepest dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace? Might they have fled to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, living in exile beyond the Emperor's reach? Or could something far stranger have been their fate, something so disturbing that the truth had to be hidden not just for political reasons, but for the psychological well-being of the Imperium itself? The evidence we'll examine suggests possibilities that range from the mundane to the apocalyptic. Some theories propose simple failure, catastrophic gene seed flaws that made these Primarchs and their legions unviable. Others suggest ideological betrayal, Primarchs who refused to embrace the Emperor's xenophobic crusade and paid the ultimate price for their descent. Still others point to the Rangdan Xenocides, a series of brutal campaigns against alien invaders that nearly destroyed the Imperium, as the key to understanding what happened to the missing Primarchs. And in the darkest corners of speculation, some suggest that one or both Primarchs might still exist, trapped in forms or circumstances too horrible to contemplate. What makes this mystery particularly compelling is that it's not just about two missing characters. The The Lost Primarchs represent a fundamental crack in the Emperor's perfect design. If these godlike beings, crafted by the Master of Mankind himself with the utmost care and precision, could fail so catastrophically that their very existence had to be erased, what does that say about the Emperor's grand plan? What does it reveal about the fragility of his creations? And if the Emperor, the most powerful human psyker who ever lived, felt compelled to hide this failure rather than learn from it openly, what might that suggest about his own limitations and fears? The other Primarchs certainly thought about their lost brothers. Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and one of the most rational and level-headed of his kind, created a council chamber on his homeworld of Makrag with 21 seats. 20 were sized for Primarchs, and 1 for the Emperor. Each chair bore the great seal of its respective legion on a banner draped across the chair back. But 2 of those banners were plain, undyed cloth, deliberately blank. When the Lion, Primarch of the Dark Angels, remarked that it was a shame those 2 brothers would never be able to attend this council, Guilliman responded simply, "Yet their absence must be marked. Places must be left for them. That is simply honour." This wasn't the response of a brother who remembered traitors. This was the reaction of someone mourning a loss, honouring the memory of fallen comrades, even though he could no longer clearly recall who they were. Similarly, Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, spoke of his concerns about another of his brothers potentially following the path of the Lost Primarchs. He confided to his equerry that he had seen darkness in the heart of Conrad Kurds, the disturbed Primarch of the Night Lords, and worried about what should be done. But he hesitated to bring the matter to Horus or Rogal Dorn, saying, "None of us wants another sanction, another empty pillar in the great investory, another brother's name excised from all record. It is shame enough to bear the grief for 2. I have no wish to add to it." Again, the language is one of grief and shame, not righteous anger or satisfaction at seeing justice done. Whatever happened to the Lost Primarchs, it wasn't something their brothers took pleasure in, or felt, was deserved. This emotional context is crucial to understanding the mystery. If the Lost Primarchs had simply been traitors who turned against the Emperor early in the Great Crusade, their brother Primarchs would likely remember them with the same bitter hatred they reserved for Horus and his fellow traitors after the heresy. Instead, we see sadness, loss, and a strange reluctance to discuss them even among brothers who shared everything else. This suggests that whatever occurred was more complex than simple betrayal, more tragic than clear-cut villainy. Piecing together the fragments of information scattered across the Black Library novels and Forge World publications, we can establish a timeline and a set of facts about the Lost Primarchs that, while incomplete, gives us solid ground to stand on before we venture into speculation. First, and most fundamentally, we know that the Second and 11th Legions and their Primarchs were expunged from Imperial records at least 43 standard years before the drop site massacre at Istvan Fiv, which occurred in Duro Farvield M31. This date comes from a conversation between Magnus the Red and Lorgar in the novel The First Heretic, where they discussed the Lost Primarchs and confirmed that both they and their legions were already gone decades before Horus began his rebellion. This firmly establishes that whatever happened to the Lost Primarchs occurred during the Great Crusade, not during or after the Horus heresy. They were casualties of the Imperium's expansion, not its civil war. The timeline can be narrowed further through other sources. In Deliverance Lost, when Corvus Corax meets the Emperor, the Master of Mankind mentions that there are 17 other Primarchs. Corax, who was the 19th Primarch found, naturally questions how this can be possible. The Emperor's face becomes bleak, filled with what Corax describes as deep sorrow, and he says only that it's a conversation for another day. This interaction proves that by the time Corax was found, the 2 Lost Primarchs were already gone. Given that Corax was discovered relatively late in the Great Crusade, this suggests the disappearance of the Lost Primarchs happened in the middle period of the Great Crusade, after many Primarchs had been found, but before the final few were located. We also know from multiple sources that both Lost Primarchs were actually found by the Emperor. They weren't Primarchs who died before they could be recovered, or who were never located. Rogal Dorn explicitly states that he had known them, if only briefly, though most of his memories of them were clouded by Malcador's psychic interference. Other Primarchs make passing references that confirm both Lost Brothers were reunited with the Emperor and given command of their respective legions, at least for a time. They participated in the Great Crusade. They fought alongside their brothers. They were, for a period, full members of the Primarch Brotherhood. The manner of their disappearance was violent and final enough to shock even warriors accustomed to the brutal realities of the Great Crusade. In the short story, The Chamber at the End of Memory, Rogal Dorn experiences a restoration of his suppressed memories and sees the truth of what happened to the Lost Primarchs. His reaction is visceral and disturbing. He sees something worse than the Horus Heresy itself, something so terrible that after viewing it, Dorn actively chooses to have Malcador suppress his memories again. He prefers to live with the uncertainty and the gnawing absence rather than carry the full knowledge of what befell his brothers. This single detail tells us volumes about the severity of whatever occurred. Rogal Dorn was not a weak-willed individual prone to denial. He was the Praetorian of Terror, the Emperor's most steadfast and duty-bound son. If he couldn't bear to remember what happened, then the truth must be staggeringly horrific. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, features prominently in theories about the Lost Primarch's fate. Multiple sources hint that the Space Wolves served as the Emperor's executioners, a legion designed specifically to be deployed against other Space Marines if necessary. In Prospero Burns, it strongly suggested that Russ and his wolves had been used in this capacity before, possibly against one or both of the Lost Legions. The Space Wolves were known for their savage efficiency and their unwavering loyalty to the Emperor, making them the ideal choice for such a grim task. Russ himself, in conversations with Malcador, admits that he has no desire to lose a third brother, implying that he was instrumental in the removal of at least one, possibly both, of the Lost Primarchs. A timeline in the Horus Heresy Book 2 Massacre lists two events marked as all data redacted that occurred in 965. M30 and 969 and Emthurus, with the Space Wolves listed as participants. These could very well be the dates when the Lost Legions were destroyed. The 4-year gap between these events might suggest that the two Lost Primarchs met different fates at different times, or that there were separate phases to their removal from Imperial records. The Emperor himself played a direct role in their erasure. Multiple sources confirm that it was the Emperor personally who cast aside the two Lost Primarchs. In The First Heretic, Lorgar expresses fear that the Emperor will break the Word-Bearers and break him personally, that they would be cast alongside the brothers they no longer speak of. Magnus the Red confirms in the same conversation that the Emperor had previously considered expunging Lorgar and the Word-Bearers in the same manner as the Second and 11th Legions due to their religiosity, but was talked out of it by several other Primarchs, including Leman Russ, Horus and Magnus himself. This reveals that the mechanism for removing Primarchs and their legions was well established, and could be invoked by the Emperor when he deemed it necessary. Malcador the Sigillite's role extended beyond memory suppression. In Wolfsbane, Malcador tells Leman Russ that the Lost Primarchs were disappointments, unlike Russ himself. He says the Emperor relies on Russ to perform his singular purpose, and that so many of the others had been disappointments, first those they do not name, then Horus and the rest, but not Russ. This statement suggests that the Lost Primarchs failed in some fundamental way to fulfill the purposes for which they were designed, and that this failure was why they were removed. Yet failure alone doesn't explain the totality of their erasure. The Emperor tolerated all manner of flaws and failures in his other sons. Angron's rage and his degraded gene seed didn't lead to his legion's destruction before the heresy. Conrad Kurtz's psychotic visions and his legion's brutal tactics were permitted to continue. Even Lorgar's slow pace of conquest and his religious devotions, which directly contradicted the imperial truth, earned censure and humiliation, but not obliteration. Whatever the Lost Primarchs did or failed to do must have been qualitatively different from the sins of their brothers. The physical evidence of the Lost Primarchs was systematically removed. In Mechanicum, Malcador leads an initiate through the Imperial Palace to a massive door. Beyond that door had once been the original laboratory for the Primarch project, before a separate location was built. The door is covered in symbols, and the initiate recognises many of them as belonging to various Space Marine legions: the Dark Angels, the Lunar Wolves, the Alpha Legion. But he also notices that 2 symbols have been scratched out or worn away. When he presses Malcador for answers, the Sigillite simply states that no one goes into that room anymore and walks away. Those obliterated symbols were almost certainly the iconography of the Second and 11th Legions, erased even from the birthplace of the Primarchs themselves. Similarly, on Malcador's throne, there are 20 skulls, 18 bear names or markings. 2 are marked only with 2 and Exun, the bare minimum identification needed. This macabre monument suggests that Malcador kept something, some token of the Lost Primarchs, even as their complete erasure was ordered. Whether these skulls actually belonged to the Lost Primarchs themselves or were symbolic representations remains unclear, but their presence on Malcador's personal throne implies he bore the weight of this secret personally. The gene seed of the Lost Primarchs, remarkably, was not completely destroyed. In the Great Work, we learn that Belisarius Cawl, the Archmagos who created the Primaris Space Marines, has been experimenting with gene seed from not only the 9 traitor legions, but also the Second and 11th Legions. This revelation shocked even Robute Guilliman, who was revived in the 41st millennium and discovered Cawl's work. When Guilliman refuses to allow Cawl to place the Primaris gene lines derived from these 11 legions into mass production, the Cawl inferior responds, "The warriors were not at fault, the science is not at fault, their Primarchs were. Chapters from your gene line have also fallen in the past millennia, Lord Regent, and we do not censor them." This statement is enormously revealing. First, it confirms that gene seed samples or data from the Lost Legions still exist within the Mechanicum's vaults on Mars. Second, it explicitly places blame on the Primarchs themselves rather than their legions or the gene seed they carried. The Space Marines of these legions were apparently not at fault for whatever occurred. This supports the theory that only the Primarchs, and perhaps their inner circles, were guilty, while the rank-and-file warriors were victims of their leaders' failures. Third, it suggests that the gene seed itself is stable and functional, implying that genetic degradation or mutation wasn't the cause of their removal, or at least not the primary cause. The memories of the Lost Primarchs, while suppressed, occasionally surface in unexpected ways. During Horus's fever dream in the Davenite Temple after being wounded by the Kinabrak Anathem, he experiences visions manipulated by the Chaos Gods. In these visions, he supposedly travels back in time to the Emperor's gene laboratory and sees the incubation pods of all 20 Primarchs before they were scattered. When his vision focuses on the 11th incubation pod, he feels an overwhelming sense of foreboding and darkness. Word-bearers present in other visions claim that if they could go back in time, they would kill the 11th Primarch in infancy to unwrite a shameful future. This suggests that whatever the 11th Primarchs did or became was known to the Chaos Gods and their servants, and was significant enough that preventing it would have altered the course of history. The emotional weight carried by the remaining Primarchs regarding their lost brothers cannot be overstated. These weren't cold military commanders shrugging off casualties. These were beings designed to form bonds, to lead and inspire. The loss of 2 of their brotherhood clearly affected them deeply. Jaghatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, muses in Scars about the unprecedented concentration of power in the hands of so few Primarchs, and his thoughts deliberately note the absence of his 2 lost brothers. The implication is that their loss diminished not just the military might of the Imperium, but something more fundamental about the nature of the Primarch Brotherhood itself. Even the traitor Primarchs, those who would later fall to chaos and wage war against the Emperor, spoke of the Lost Primarchs with something approaching reverence for their mystery. In the First Heretic, both Magnus and Lorgar discussed them carefully, acknowledging that Horus and Fulgrim had taken an oath never to speak of their lost brothers again. The fact that such an oath was necessary and that even the rebellious sons honoured it speaks to the severity of the prohibition surrounding these figures. Whatever happened to the Lost Primarchs was so serious that even those who would later commit the ultimate betrayal still respected the silence demanded around their predecessors. The Rangdan Xenocides emerge as a crucial element in understanding the Lost Primarchs, a rare record that accidentally found its way into copies of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer in the 41st millennium, revealed that the Second and 11th Legions participated in the campaigns of the Rangdan Xenocides during the Great Crusade in the 860s, M30. The scope and nature of their involvement remains unrecorded, but the mere confirmation of their presence during these catastrophic wars provides our strongest clue about what might have happened to them. The Rangdan Xenocides represent one of the Great Crusade's darkest chapters, a series of wars so terrible that they nearly ended the Imperium before it could truly begin. Understanding these campaigns is essential to understanding what might have happened to the Lost Primarchs, because the evidence strongly suggests their fates were intertwined with these apocalyptic conflicts. The Rangdan Xenocides actually comprised 3 separate major campaigns, though some sources suggest there may have been more. They began around 839 and M30, when Imperial expeditionary fleets pushing into the galactic north and east encountered the Rangda, a xenos species unlike anything humanity had faced before. The Rangda, sometimes called the Rangdan Cerebrors in Imperial records, possessed military power and technological sophistication that made them an existential threat to the nascent Imperium. These weren't primitive aliens to be easily conquered, or minor kingdoms to be integrated into the Imperial fold. The Rangda were apex predators, and humanity had just stumbled into their hunting grounds. The first contact at Advex Moors set the tone for what was to come. The First Legion, the Dark Angels under their Primarch Lionel Johnson, engaged the Rangda there and lost 5,000 battle brothers over 4 months of grinding warfare. For a Space Marine Legion to suffer such casualties while failing to achieve victory was virtually unheard of. These were the Emperor's finest warriors, enhanced far beyond normal human capabilities, wielding the best weapons the Imperium could produce, and they were being systematically destroyed. The Rangda weren't just defeating Space Marines, they were killing them in numbers that shocked even the most hardened Imperial commanders. The scale of the threat became apparent when the Rangda launched their full invasion in 862.30. They attacked from both the galactic north and east simultaneously, a coordinated assault that stretched Imperial forces to their breaking point. Entire expeditionary fleets vanished without a single survivor, their fate unknown but presumably horrific. Worlds that had recently pledged allegiance to the Emperor were laid waste, their populations enslaved or worse. Dozens of Titan legions, the godlike war machines of the Mechanicum, were obliterated. And entire Space Marine legions, the plural is used specifically in the sources, were said to be lost to the Imperium. The losses inflicted during the Rangdan Xenocides would not be exceeded until the Horus Heresy itself, decades later. Think about what that means. The Horus Heresy was the greatest catastrophe in human history, a civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium and killed millions of Space Marines, billions of Imperial army soldiers, and devastated thousands of worlds. The Rangdan Xenocides approached that level of catastrophic destruction, and they did so in a compressed time frame with fewer forces available to resist them. For a period of years it genuinely seemed that the Imperium might fall, that humanity's great dream of reunification would end in extinction at the hands of a xenos horror from beyond the galactic rim. What made the Rangda so deadly? The sources provide tantalizing but incomplete details. They possessed mind control technology that could subvert and enslave their enemies, turning them into weapons against their own kind. They had ships that could stand toe-to-toe with Imperial vessels and prevail. Their ground forces were described as lithe and vaguely vulpine in form, though sources also mention them controlling various slave cohorts and twisted biological constructs. The Rangda maintained massive battle stations the size of moons, installations so enormous and heavily armed that even the great flagships of the Space Marine legions couldn't match them in direct combat. Perhaps most disturbing, the Rangda seemed capable of corrupting or infecting their enemies in ways that went beyond simple physical conquest. The sources speak of tainting that affected entire populations, corruption that ran so deep it necessitated the complete quarantine and eventual destruction of compromised worlds. The Order of the Broken Claws, a specialized unit within the Dark Angels, was established specifically to study Rangdan remains and watch for any signs of their return, suggesting that even after their defeat, the threat they represented was considered ongoing and serious enough to warrant eternal vigilance. The scope of the Rangdan Wars can be understood through the numbers involved. Over more than 2 decades of warfare, 19 systems were completely destroyed. Over 300,000 Space Marines participated in the campaigns, with casualties in the tens of thousands. 3 Primarchs were confirmed as leading their forces in the climactic battles. 9 separate legions became embroiled in the fighting. Millions upon millions of Imperial army soldiers died. The Titan legions lost dozens of their precious god machines. The Mechanicum committed huge resources to the war effort, and through it all the Second and 11th Legions were there, fighting alongside their brother legions against an enemy that threatened to extinguish humanity's light forever. The first Rangdan Xenocides saw the Dark Angels and other legions struggling to contain the initial invasion. The sources are somewhat contradictory about exact timing and involvement, but it's clear that this first campaign was defensive in nature, focused on stopping the Rangdan advance and preventing them from penetrating deeper into Imperial space. The fighting was desperate and costly, with conventional tactics proving inadequate against the alien threat. The second Rangdan Xenocide, occurring in 862 M30, was the most catastrophic of the 3. This is when the Rangda invaded in full force and when the Imperium came closest to defeat. The documentary evidence specifically mentions the Second and 11th Legions participating in this campaign alongside Solar Auxilia forces. Over 2 decades of warfare followed, 19 systems were laid to waste, and the losses were staggering. The Emperor himself had to intervene personally, breaking something called the Labyrinth of Night, which seems to have been a crucial Rangdan stronghold, or perhaps a warp-based defence system. Only the Emperor's direct intervention stymied the Rangdan threat and turned the tide of the war. The third Rangdan Xenocide, conducted sometime in the 890s as SM30, was described as the final solution to the Rangdan problem. Lionel Johnson and Lehman Russ, often antagonistic toward each other, found common purpose in the complete and utter annihilation of the Rangda. After a period of relative quiet, the White Scars discovered that the Rangda had returned to their ancient homeworlds and were rebuilding their strength. Rather than allow them another chance to threaten the Imperium, the Lion and the Wolf, as they were known, launched what sources describe as a quiet and undignified slaughter, a xenocidal campaign undertaken with stoic determination. The goal wasn't conquest or compliance, it was extermination. By the end of the third Rangdan Xenocide, the Rangda were supposedly extinct, though the fact that the Order of the Broken Claws maintained their watch suggests that not everyone believed they were truly gone. Sentinels placed by the First Legion continued to monitor the regions where the Rangda had dwelt, watching for any sign of their return. The entire affair was hushed up as much as possible. Veterans were sworn to silence or eliminated. Worlds too tainted by Rangdan corruption were abandoned rather than reclaimed. The truth of how close humanity had come to extinction was buried beneath layers of classification and obfuscation. Now consider the Lost Primarchs in this context. We know they participated in the second Rangdan Xenocide, the most catastrophic campaign of the 3. We know that entire Space Marine legions, plural, were lost during these wars. We know that the Rangdan possessed the ability to control minds and corrupt their enemies at a fundamental level. We know that the timeline of the Rangdan Xenocides overlaps significantly with the period when the Lost Primarchs were removed from Imperial records. The connections seem almost too obvious to ignore. One prevailing theory suggests that the 11th Primarch was scattered by the Chaos Gods into Rangdan territory. When the Emperor finally located him, it was too late. Either the Rangda had killed him before he could be recovered, or, more disturbingly, they had enslaved him with their mind control technology. A Primarch under Rangdan control would be a weapon of unimaginable destructive potential. If the 11th Legion followed their corrupted Primarch, or went mad with rage upon discovering his fate, the Emperor might have had no choice but to destroy them entirely. The shame wouldn't be in defeat, which even the greatest warriors can suffer, but in the corruption, the fact that one of his own sons had been turned into a weapon against humanity. The Quiet Primarch, the second, described in fragmentary sources as contemplative and reserved, might have taken a different path during the Rangdan Xenocides. Perhaps he witnessed the true horror of the Rangda, the scale of the casualties, the seemingly endless waves of alien forces, and concluded that the Imperial strategy of xenocidal extermination wasn't working. Perhaps he attempted to negotiate with the Rangda, or tried to forge an alliance with another xenos species to help fight them. In the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, any hint of xenos sympathy or cooperation is considered the ultimate heresy. If the second Primarch argued for a different approach, if he refused to continue the meat grinder warfare that was costing so many lives, the Emperor might have viewed this as betrayal, worthy of erasure. Another possibility involves direct Rangdan corruption or infection. The sources make it clear that the Rangda could taint their enemies in ways that went beyond physical wounds or simple mind control. What if one of the Lost Primarchs was exposed to some Rangdan bioweapon or psychic attack that began transforming him and his gene seed? What if the corruption was so profound that it threatened to spread to other legions through shared gene seed stocks or psychic resonance? The Emperor might have decided that quarantine and eventual destruction were the only options, no matter how painful that choice might be. The secrecy would be necessary to prevent panic and to avoid revealing the vulnerability of the Primarchs themselves to future enemies. The Dark Angels Legion, which bore the brunt of the fighting against the Rangda, suffered catastrophic losses during these campaigns. They went from being the largest Space Marine Legion to suffering such severe casualties that they lost their status as the most numerous. If we accept that one or both Lost Legions were also present in force during these campaigns, similar or even worse losses would be expected. A legion that took 50% casualties or higher might become non-viable, lacking the numbers to function as an effective fighting force. If their Primarch was dead or compromised, and their numbers reduced to a fraction of their former strength, absorption into other legions might have seemed like the only practical solution. The question of why the truth had to be hidden brings us back to Rogal Dorn's reaction in the chamber at the end of memory. Dorn saw something worse than the Horus Heresy itself. What could be worse than half of your brothers turning traitor and trying to kill you? Perhaps the knowledge that the enemy wasn't Chaos or Xenos, but the fundamental fragility of the Primarchs themselves. The Horus Heresy, terrible as it was, could be blamed on the machinations of the Chaos Gods. It was external corruption, seduction by forces beyond mortal understanding. But if the Lost Primarchs fell due to inherent flaws, due to weaknesses built into their very design by the Emperor, that would strike at the foundation of the entire Imperial project. Imagine if the truth was that the Primarchs, for all their godlike power, could be broken by the right combination of circumstances, that they could fail not through moral weakness, but through the limitations of their creation, that the Emperor's grand design contained fatal flaws that he either couldn't or wouldn't correct. Revealing this truth would undermine faith in the entire Primarch program, potentially leading other Primarchs to question their own stability and the soundness of the Emperor's plans. It might encourage enemies to seek ways to exploit these vulnerabilities, and it would reveal the Emperor as fallible, as capable of creating failure as well as success. The Rangdan Xenocides also provide context for the Space Wolves' role as executioners. If Leman Russ and his legion were tasked with destroying one or both Lost Legions during or immediately after these campaigns, it would explain why the Wolves demonstrated no surprise or hesitation when later ordered to attack Magnus and the Thousand Suns during the burning of Prospero. They had done it before. They knew how to fight other Space Marines. They had proven their loyalty by carrying out the most painful order a warrior could receive, destroying their own brothers in arms. The psychological toll on those involved must have been immense. The Primarchs weren't just military commanders. They were a brotherhood, united by their shared origin and their common purpose. Losing two brothers to treachery or failure would be devastating enough, but having to actively participate in their destruction, to fight against warriors you had bled beside, to kill Space Marines who shared your gene seed and your ideals, would leave scars that no amount of psychic memory suppression could fully heal. This might explain why even those Primarchs, whose memories were suppressed, still feel the weight of grief and loss when the subject arises. The emotional truth remains even when the factual details have been hidden away. While the mystery of what happened to the Lost Primarchs themselves may never be fully resolved, the fate of their Space Marine legions presents its own set of intriguing questions and a somewhat clearer picture, though still painted in shadowy strokes and unconfirmed rumours. The most persistent theory about the Lost Legions centres on the Ultramarines. Multiple sources, both in-universe and in the meta-narrative of the novels themselves, hint that the 13th Legion absorbed the Space Marines of the Second and 11th Legions following the expungement of their Primarchs. This theory has been circulating in the Warhammer community for decades, and Games Workshop has deliberately neither confirmed nor denied it, instead adding just enough supporting evidence to make it plausible, while maintaining enough ambiguity to prevent it from becoming canon. In the First Heretic, during a conversation among word-bearers, Argyll Tal and his brothers discuss the Lost Primarchs. One of them mentions, almost as an aside, that it's no secret that the Ultramarines Legion swelled to eclipse all other legions around the time the 2nd and 11th were forgotten by Imperial archives. The 13th definitely increased their numbers dramatically during this period, though the exact source of this growth is never officially stated. The timing is too convenient to be mere coincidence. When two legions are destroyed, and a third suddenly becomes the largest by far, the implication seems clear even if it's never explicitly confirmed. However, other word-bearers dismiss this as rumour and conjecture, as insipid speculation not worthy of serious consideration. This deliberate ambiguity is typical of how Games Workshop handles the Lost Primarchs material. They provide evidence that supports the theory, then immediately undercut it with skepticism, leaving readers to draw their own conclusions. The technique maintains the mystery while giving lore enthusiasts something to discuss and debate. If we accept the theory that loyalist elements of the Lost Legions were folded into the Ultramarines, it raises interesting questions about what this process would have looked like. Space Marines don't simply change their Legion allegiance. Their genetic material derives from their Primarch's gene seed. They carry his genetic legacy in their very cells. Asking them to abandon that identity and become something else would be asking them to deny a fundamental part of what they are. Yet we know that Space Marines can, under extreme circumstances, transfer allegiance. The process would likely have involved extensive psychological conditioning, perhaps even the memory suppression techniques that Malcador used on the Primarchs themselves. The 2nd and 11th Legionnaires would have had their memories of their Primarchs and their Legion's history carefully edited or erased. They would have been given new identities as Ultramarines, inducted into the command structure of the 13th Legion, and dispersed throughout its ranks to prevent them from forming cohesive units that might remember their origins. This process would explain several puzzling aspects of the Lost Primarchs mystery. First, it accounts for how the gene seed of the 2nd and 11th could still exist in Mechanicum vaults for Belisarius' call to experiment with millennia later. If the Space Marines themselves survived, their progenoid glands would have continued to produce gene seed that would be tithed to Mars as part of standard Imperial procedure. Second, it explains why the Khal Inferior specifically states that the warriors were not at fault, only their Primarchs. If large numbers of these Space Marines were deemed salvageable and worth incorporating into other legions, it suggests that their loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium remained intact even if their Primarchs had failed in some catastrophic way. The Ultramarines weren't the only legion rumoured to have absorbed elements of the Lost Legions. Some theories suggest that the Imperial Fists also received an influx of warriors around the same time, though the evidence for this is even more circumstantial than the Ultramarines theory. The reasoning goes that Rogal Dorn, as one of the Primarchs who knew the Lost Primarchs and was deeply affected by their fate, might have been entrusted with taking some of their surviving warriors under his command. The Imperial Fist's reputation for stoicism and discipline would make them ideal for integrating warriors who had lost their original Legion identity and needed a new purpose. An alternative theory proposes that instead of absorbing entire units of Space Marines from the Lost Legions, the Ultramarines and other legions might simply have taken over the recruiting worlds and resources previously controlled by the Second and 11th. The sudden expansion of the Ultramarines' domain during this period could be explained by annexing the planets that had supplied recruits to the Lost Legions. This would increase the 13th Legion's strength over time through accelerated recruitment rather than through immediate absorption of existing warriors. This resource-focused theory has the advantage of being less controversial within the established lore. It doesn't require the complicated process of transferring Space Marines between legions, nor does it necessitate extensive memory suppression of thousands of warriors. It simply proposes that when two legions ceased to exist, their territories and resources didn't just disappear, they were reallocated to existing legions, with the Ultramarines, under the administratively skilled Roboute Guilliman, being the primary beneficiary. However, not all members of the Lost Legions would have been candidates for absorption or reassignment. The sources hint at more sinister fates for those deemed too compromised or too knowledgeable about what really happened. The Space Wolves, acting as the Emperor's executioners, would have carried out the destruction of those elements of the Lost Legions that couldn't be salvaged. This might have included the Primarch's inner circles, specialised units that were too closely tied to their fallen leaders, or warriors who had been present for whatever catastrophic event led to the Legion's destruction, and couldn't be trusted to keep silent. Imagine being a Space Marine in one of the Lost Legions, serving faithfully in the Great Crusade, only to be told that your Primarch has been deemed a failure and expunged from history. Then being given a choice, if choice it could be called, renounce your legion, accept memory suppression, and join another legion under a new identity, or face execution alongside those deemed too dangerous to be allowed to live. For a Space Marine, whose entire existence revolves around loyalty to his Primarch and his legion, this would be a fate arguably worse than death. It would be the annihilation of identity, the erasure of purpose, a kind of death that leaves the body alive but kills everything that makes that warrior who he is. The gene seed issue becomes particularly relevant when we consider the long-term implications. If Space Marines from the Lost Legions were incorporated into the Ultramarines, they would have carried their original gene seed in their progenoid glands. When these glands were harvested after death, as is standard procedure, that gene seed would have been mixed into the Ultramarine stocks. Over time, as successive generations of Space Marines were created, the Lost Legion's genetic legacy would have become irrevocably intermingled with that of the 13th Legion. This genetic mixing could explain some of the variations seen in Ultramarine successor chapters. While most would carry predominantly Guilliman's gene seed, some might have a higher proportion of gene seed derived from the Lost Primarchs, leading to subtle differences in appearance, temperament, or capabilities that don't quite match the Ultramarines' template. It would also mean that the Lost Primarchs' genetic legacy survived in a diluted form, scattered across hundreds of chapters and tens of thousands of Space Marines, none of whom know they carry the genes of the Forgotten and the Purged. Belisarius calls experiments with the Lost Legion's gene seed in the 41st millennium reveal that the Mechanicum maintained pure samples separate from any that might have been mixed into other legions. These samples, stored in the biologist's vaults on Mars, represent the last complete reserves of the Lost Primarchs' genetic material. Kuhl's willingness to experiment with this gene seed, creating Primaris Space Marines derived from the Second and Eleventh, alongside those from the Traitor Legions, suggests he believes there's nothing inherently flawed about the gene seed itself. Robute Guilliman's reaction to Kuhl's experiments is telling. He categorically refuses to allow these gene lines to enter mass production, placing them in the same prohibited category as the Traitor Legion gene seed. This isn't a decision based on genetic instability or concerns about the quality of the warriors these samples would produce. It's a political and historical decision, maintaining the Emperor's original decree that these legions should remain forgotten. Guilliman's refusal suggests that he either remembers enough about what happened to the Lost Primarchs to believe their gene seed should stay prohibited, or he respects his father's judgment enough to maintain the ban even without fully understanding its reasoning. The Carl Inferior's argument that the warriors were not at fault deserves deeper examination. This artificial intelligence, created by Carl to preserve his knowledge and thought processes, explicitly separates the guilt of the Primarchs from the potential of their gene seed and the Space Marines derived from it. It points out that chapters from Guilliman's own gene line have fallen to chaos, or been declared renegade in the millennia since the heresy. Yet those chapters are censured individually, while the Ultramarines' gene seed as a whole remains in use. By this logic, the sins of the Lost Primarchs shouldn't condemn their genetic legacy forever. But Guilliman isn't swayed by this argument. His refusal might stem from awareness that whatever happened to the Lost Primarchs wasn't comparable to ordinary chapter falls to chaos. It was something unique, something so terrible that the genetic line itself must remain forbidden regardless of its apparent stability. Or perhaps Guilliman recognises that introducing Lost Legion gene seed into the Imperium would inevitably lead to questions, investigations, and potentially the uncovering of truths that were buried for good reasons. The fate of individual Space Marines from the Lost Legions who might still exist in the 41st millennium is a fascinating speculation. If some were absorbed into other legions and survived through the Horus Heresy and the subsequent 10,000 years, they would be among the oldest living Space Marines in the Imperium. Their memories of their original legion would be suppressed or erased, but would they feel some sense of disconnect, some awareness that something in their past doesn't quite fit the official narrative of their chapter's history? Would their gene seed, when extracted and examined, show subtle differences that might puzzle apothecaries who didn't know about their true origins? More likely, any Space Marines who were physically transferred between legions died long ago, either in the Horus Heresy or in the countless conflicts that followed. 10,000 years is an enormous span of time even for Space Marines, whose enhanced physiology grants them potential immortality, but not invulnerability. The constant warfare of the Imperium ensures that few warriors survive more than a few centuries, let alone millennia. What persists is their genetic legacy, scattered and diluted across the chapters, descended from the legions that absorbed them. A hidden heritage that shapes warriors who will never know from whom they truly descend. The mystery of the Lost Primarchs has spawned countless theories within the Warhammer 40,000 community. While Games Workshop will likely never provide a definitive answer, examining the major theories and the evidence supporting them gives us insight into the possibilities and helps us understand why this mystery has proven so enduring and compelling. Theory 1. Catastrophic gene seed failure. One of the most straightforward explanations suggests that one or both Lost Primarchs suffered from severe genetic flaws that made them and their legions unviable for continued service. This theory draws support from several pieces of evidence, particularly the concerns expressed by other Primarchs about gene seed stability. Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, explicitly stated in Fear to Tread that he was keeping his legion's genetic flaw secret because he would not be responsible for the erasure of the Blood Angels from Imperial history. He stated he would not have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as his legion's only memorial. This implies that genetic defects were a known cause for legion erasure, and that at least some Primarchs understood their legions could be destroyed if their gene seed was deemed too unstable. The Blood Angels themselves provide a template for what serious gene seed problems look like. Their Red Thirst and Black Rage are severe mutations that cause affected warriors to lose control and become bloodthirsty berserkers. The condition is irrecoverable in most cases, and it affects every generation of Blood Angels to some degree. Yet Sanguinius managed to keep this secret long enough to establish his legion's worth to the Emperor, and even after the secret was revealed, the Blood Angels continued to serve throughout the heresy and beyond. If the Lost Primarchs' gene seed flaws were significantly worse than the Blood Angels, so severe that the Space Marines created from them were fundamentally unstable or dangerous, the Emperor might have concluded that these legions couldn't be allowed to continue. Perhaps the warriors they produced went mad too quickly, or their mutations made them unsuitable for the disciplined warfare the Emperor required, or the defects were progressive, meaning each successive generation of Space Marines would be worse than the previous one. The gene seed of the Primarchs wasn't created in isolation. The Emperor used his own genetic material as the foundation, then customized each Primarch's genome to fulfill specific purposes. This process involved working with forces and technologies that were only partially understood, even by the Master of Mankind. The Chaos God's interference when they scattered the infant Primarchs could have introduced additional complications, or triggered latent instabilities that the Emperor hadn't accounted for in his original designs. If we accept this theory, the secrecy surrounding the Lost Primarchs makes sense as a way to prevent other legions from learning about potential genetic vulnerabilities they might share. If one Primarch's gene seed could fail catastrophically, what's to stop others from experiencing similar problems? The Emperor might have decided that maintaining the myth of Primarch perfection was more important than acknowledging the reality of genetic fallibility. However, this theory has significant weaknesses. The Call Inferior explicitly states that the gene seed wasn't at fault, only the Primarchs themselves. If the gene seed was stable enough for Call to successfully create Primaris Marines from it 10,000 years later, then catastrophic genetic failure seems unlikely to be the whole story. Additionally, the emotional weight carried by the remaining Primarchs doesn't quite fit. If their brothers had simply been the victims of genetic bad luck, the tone would likely be more sympathetic and less shame-focused. Theory 2. Xenos sympathy or cooperation. This theory proposes that one or both Lost Primarchs developed sympathetic attitudes toward Xenos species, or, worse from the Imperium's perspective, actively cooperated with aliens against the Emperor's explicit xenophobic doctrines. In the rigid ideology of the Great Crusade, this would constitute betrayal of the highest order. Several pieces of evidence support this theory. Fulgrim, in one account, mentions that one of the Lost Primarchs led an expedition to the Ymga monolith on the eastern fringe. The Ymga monolith is now known to be a Necron artifact, a phase node designed to hold back the Imperium. If one of the Lost Primarchs was exploring ancient Xenos technology and possibly learning from it, the Emperor might have viewed this as dangerously close to tech heresy and Xenos corruption. The Emperor's policy towards Xenos during the Great Crusade was absolutist. Human dominance wasn't just preferred, it was mandated. Any alien species that wouldn't submit to human rule was to be destroyed, and even those willing to cooperate were viewed with deep suspicion. The Imperium made occasional use of Xenos auxiliaries, but these were always temporary arrangements of convenience, never genuine alliances. A Primarch who advocated for a different approach, who argued that some Xenos civilizations should be preserved, or that humanity could benefit from cooperation with alien species, would be placing himself in direct opposition to one of the Emperor's core principles. Consider a scenario where one of the Lost Primarchs was raised by a Xenos species after the Chaos God scattered the infant Primarchs across the galaxy. Most Primarchs landed on human worlds, but what if one or both landed on alien planets? A Primarch raised by aliens who developed bonds with xenos mentors and companions might retain sympathies toward his adopted species even after being reunited with the Emperor. He might refuse to participate in their extermination or actively work to protect them from Imperial compliance forces. This scenario becomes particularly compelling when we consider the Rangdan Xenocides. If the second Primarch, described as quiet and contemplative, witnessed the horrific casualties of the wars against the Rangda and concluded that negotiation or alliance with other xenos species might be preferable to endless xenocidal warfare, he might have attempted to pursue unauthorized diplomatic contacts. The Emperor, seeing this as weakness or betrayal, could have ordered his execution and the dispersal of his legion. The theory gains additional weight when we consider that Omegon, one of the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion, believed that the Emperor viewed the Primarchs as tools, and that the Great Crusade was essentially a test to determine which tools were worth keeping. Under this cynical interpretation, the Lost Primarchs were simply discarded when they proved inadequate for the Emperor's purposes. A Primarch who couldn't or wouldn't fulfill his role as a xenocidal war leader would be a failed tool, worthy only of being thrown away. The profound secrecy surrounding the Lost Primarchs makes sense under this theory, because admitting that human-xenos cooperation might sometimes be preferable to warfare would undermine the ideological foundation of the Great Crusade. If one Primarch had successfully argued for preserving certain alien species, other Primarchs and Imperial commanders might begin questioning their orders to exterminate xenos on sight. The entire Imperial project, built on the assumption of human supremacy and the necessity of alien destruction, could unravel. Yet this theory also faces challenges. The Emperor tolerated significant deviations from his ideal among the other Primarchs. He allowed Fulgrim's obsession with perfection, Kurz's brutal tactics, Angron's rage-fueled warfare, and Lorgar's slow pace of conquest. If he could accommodate these variations, why would xenos sympathy be uniquely intolerable? Unless, of course, the sympathetic Primarch actively interfered with Imperial military operations, possibly even fighting alongside xenos allies against Imperial forces. That level of overt betrayal might have necessitated the complete erasure we see. Theory 3. Rangdan corruption or infection. Building on the established connection between the Lost Primarchs and the Rangdan Xenocides, this theory proposes that one or both Primarchs were corrupted, infected, or fundamentally altered by contact with the Rangda in ways that made them irredeemable threats to the Imperium. The Rangda possessed sophisticated mind control technology. We know they could subvert and enslave their enemies, turning captured forces into weapons against the Imperium. What would happen if a Primarch, a being of immense psychic and physical power, fell under Rangdan control? The devastation such a corrupted Primarch could wreak would be incalculable. He would know Imperial tactics, strategies, and weaknesses. He would command the loyalty of an entire Space Marine Legion. He might serve as a vector for Rangdan corruption, potentially spreading it to other legions through psychic contact or shared gene seed. The theory proposes that the 11th Primarch, whose incubation pod filled Horus with foreboding in his chaos-induced visions, was scattered to Rangdan space and either died before recovery or was enslaved when the Emperor finally located him. If found alive but corrupted, the Emperor would have faced an impossible choice: attempt to purge the Rangdan influence and risk failure, potentially losing a Primarch forever to alien control, or destroy his son before the corruption could spread. The second Primarch, under this theory, might have led the campaign to retrieve or destroy his corrupted brother. The quiet, contemplative nature attributed to him would fit someone who bore the horrible burden of killing a brother for the good of the Imperium. The shame and grief this action would cause might explain why his own fate was so closely tied to the 11th's. Perhaps he couldn't bear the weight of what he'd done and went into self-imposed exile. Or perhaps the Emperor decided that anyone who knew the truth about Rangdan corruption of a Primarch was too dangerous to be allowed to live, even if that knowledge was gained through loyal service. The Rangdan's ability to corrupt and taint goes beyond simple mind control. Sources mention that compromised worlds had to be quarantined and eventually destroyed because the corruption ran too deep to be cleansed. If a Primarch was exposed to this same level of tainting, if the Rangdan infection worked its way into his very cells and gene seed, there might be no way to purge it without destroying the host entirely. Any Space Marines created from his gene seed would carry the taint, creating a legion of potential Rangdan sleeper agents within the Imperium's military forces. This theory explains several puzzling aspects of the Lost Primarchs mystery. It accounts for the timing, placing their removal during or immediately after the Rangdan Xenocides. It explains why the truth had to be hidden so completely. Revealing that a Primarch could be corrupted by xenos influence would undermine faith in the Emperor's creations and potentially create panic about whether other Primarchs might be similarly vulnerable. It justifies the extreme measures taken, including the destruction of entire legions and the memory suppression of those who knew the truth. The reaction of Rogal Dorn when his memories were restored fits this theory particularly well. If he saw one of his brothers twisted into something horrific by alien influence, if he witnessed the Emperor being forced to destroy his own son because the corruption couldn't be reversed, that would certainly be traumatic enough to make the Horus Heresy seem almost bearable by comparison. At least with the Heresy, the traitors made a choice, corrupted by chaos but still recognisably themselves. Rangdan corruption might have stripped away all trace of the original Primarch, leaving only a puppet dancing on alien strings. However, this theory struggles with the Khal Inferior's assertion that the gene seed itself wasn't at fault. If the Lost Primarchs were corrupted by Rangdan influence that affected their genetic material, their gene seed should carry traces of that corruption even 10,000 years later. The fact that Khal can work with it successfully suggests that any corruption was limited to the Primarchs themselves rather than being embedded in their genetic legacy. Theory 4. Discovery of forbidden truths. This darker theory suggests that one or both Lost Primarchs discovered truths about the Emperor, the Warp, or the nature of the Imperium itself that the Master of Mankind could not allow to be revealed. Knowledge can be as dangerous as any weapon, and in the wrong hands or minds, the truth could destroy the Emperor's carefully constructed plans for humanity's future. What forbidden knowledge might warrant such extreme measures? Perhaps one of the Lost Primarchs discovered the true nature of the Chaos Gods before the Emperor intended to reveal that information. The Emperor kept his Primarchs and Space Marines deliberately ignorant of chaos, believing that knowledge of these entities would make them more vulnerable to corruption. If a Primarch uncovered the truth independently and began sharing it with others, the Emperor might have decided that eliminating the Primarch was preferable to risking the spiritual contamination of his forces. Alternatively, a Lost Primarch might have discovered something about the Emperor himself. Perhaps he learned how the Emperor gained his power, the bargain he struck on Molech when he passed through the Warp Gate and emerged transformed. Perhaps he uncovered evidence that the Emperor had made deals with the Chaos Gods to create the Primarchs, and that these deals were now coming due. Perhaps he learned that the Emperor viewed the Primarchs as disposable tools rather than true sons, and realised that the affection they believed he felt for them was merely manipulative theatre, designed to ensure their loyalty. The theory of forbidden knowledge gain additional plausibility when we consider Magnus the Red's later fate. Magnus discovered the truth about chaos, and tried to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal by sending a psychic message through the warp. This well-intentioned act breached the Emperor's webway project beneath the Imperial Palace, creating a disaster that would eventually trap the Emperor on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. The Emperor's response was to order Magnus and his entire legion destroyed, though this order was later modified. If the consequences of Magnus learning too much were that severe, imagine how the Emperor might have reacted to a Primarch learning too much at an earlier stage of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor had more flexibility and fewer constraints on his actions. Under this theory, the profound secrecy makes perfect sense. If the truth that led to the Lost Primarchs' destruction is something the Emperor still doesn't want revealed in the 41st millennium, then maintaining the mystery becomes essential. The knowledge isn't just dangerous to the individuals who possess it, but to the stability of the Imperium itself. As long as the truth remains hidden, it can't corrupt others or inspire dangerous questions about the nature and legitimacy of Imperial rule. This theory could explain why Rogal Dorn chose to have his memories suppressed again after learning the truth. If he saw evidence that the Emperor was willing to destroy his own sons not for failing militarily or falling to chaos, but simply for knowing too much, that revelation would shake Dorn's faith to its core. The Praetorian of Terror, whose entire existence revolves around loyalty to the Emperor, might find the truth so disturbing that embracing ignorance becomes psychologically necessary. The weakness of this theory lies in the question of how the knowledge could have been contained. Information wants to spread. If one Primarch learned something, his commanders and advisors likely also learned it. Destroying the Primarch doesn't destroy the information, unless you also eliminate everyone else who was exposed to it, which would mean destroying significant portions of 2 entire legions. While extreme, this isn't impossible, but it does seem like the sort of brutal overreaction that would leave psychological scars on everyone involved, including the other Primarchs who carried out the purge. Theory 5. Imprisonment rather than execution. The final major theory we'll examine proposes that one or both Lost Primarchs weren't actually killed, but were instead imprisoned somewhere secure, where they couldn't interfere with the Emperor's plans or share whatever knowledge or capabilities made them dangerous. This theory requires less of a departure from established law than might initially seem apparent, and it opens up fascinating possibilities for the future of the 40k setting. Evidence for imprisoned Primarchs is circumstantial but intriguing. Several sources mention facilities deep beneath the Imperial Palace, where the most dangerous prisoners and artifacts are kept, guarded by the Custodian Guard's elite Shadow Keepers. An entity referred to in some fan theories as Subject 11 is supposedly imprisoned in these deepest dungeons, watched over by guards who have no knowledge of what they're guarding or why it's so important that it remain contained. The nature of Primarch physiology makes execution surprisingly difficult. These are beings who can survive wounds that would kill normal humans instantly. They possess regenerative abilities that allow them to recover from horrific injuries. Several Primarchs survived what should have been mortal wounds. Guilliman was preserved in stasis after being fatally poisoned. Vulcan is believed to be a perpetual who cannot truly die. Even mortally wounded Ferrus Manus's head was recovered and possibly preserved. If the Emperor wanted to ensure a Primarch couldn't return or be resurrected by his enemies, imprisonment might be more reliable than execution. Consider the resources the Emperor would invest in a Primarch. Decades of research, vast quantities of genetic material, psychic power channeled into each creation. Even if a Primarch had failed or betrayed him, would the Emperor simply destroy that investment? Or might he imprison the failed son, perhaps hoping to one day find a way to purge whatever flaw or corruption had made the Primarch unsuitable for service? The theory that one Primarch might be imprisoned while the other was executed offers an elegant explanation for why both are treated as equally gone despite potentially having very different fates. If one fought against the Imperium and was destroyed, while the other surrendered or was captured before such drastic measures became necessary, the end result would be the same from the perspective of the other legions. 2 empty plinths, 2 Primarchs removed from service, 2 legions dispersed or destroyed. An imprisoned Primarch presents narrative possibilities that Games Workshop might find useful in the future. The return of Primarchs has been a major element of 40k's evolving storyline, with Guilliman returning to lead the Imperium in its darkest hour. If one or both Lost Primarchs were actually imprisoned rather than dead, they could potentially be recovered in future story developments, either as allies if their original failures were due to misunderstanding or corruption that could be cleansed, or as antagonists if they've spent 10,000 years nursing their resentment in the darkness beneath the palace. The emotional reactions of the other Primarchs fit better with imprisonment than execution in some ways. The grief and shame they feel might stem from knowing that their brothers are suffering a fate worse than death. Eternal imprisonment, forgotten by history, unable to die but denied any possibility of redemption or purpose. This would be a truly horrific punishment, one that might weigh more heavily on the minds of warriors who value glory and legacy than simple execution would. However, this theory faces significant practical obstacles. Primarchs are incredibly dangerous, even when confined. Keeping one imprisoned for thousands of years would require constant vigilance and enormous resources. The risk that an imprisoned Primarch might escape, or be freed by enemies of the Imperium, would be substantial. Unless the imprisonment involves more than physical chains, perhaps psychic restraints or temporal stasis, the logistics of maintaining such confinement for 10 millennia seem nearly impossible. The Lost Primarchs represent something profound in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, an acknowledgement that not everything can or should be explained. In an age of comprehensive wikis, detailed timelines, and extensive cross-referenced lore, the deliberate maintenance of mystery serves important functions both within the fiction and for the community that engages with it. From a narrative perspective, the Lost Primarchs embody the idea that history, even carefully recorded history, has gaps. The Imperium may present itself as having complete knowledge of its own past, but the truth is messier. Records are lost, memories fade. Those in power sometimes deliberately obscure uncomfortable truths. The Lost Primarchs remind us that the 40k universe is vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond memory, and filled with secrets that may never be uncovered. This sense of depth and mystery makes the setting feel more real, more lived in, than it would if every question had a definitive answer. The mystery also serves as a mirror for the limitations and failures of the Imperium itself. The Emperor's grand design wasn't perfect. His Primarchs, for all their godlike abilities, were fallible. The Great Crusade, despite its magnificent scope, contained tragedies and defeats that had to be hidden rather than acknowledged. The Lost Primarchs represent the Imperium's original sin, the first great failure that necessitated a cover-up, establishing a pattern of deception and historical revision that would repeat throughout Imperial history. For the Warhammer community, the Lost Primarchs serve as a canvas for creativity and speculation. Players can create their own interpretations, build armies based on their theories about what the Lost Legions might have been like, and engage in endless debates about the evidence and possibilities. This participatory aspect of the mystery transforms passive consumers of lore into active investigators and interpreters, deepening their engagement with the setting. Games Workshop's handling of the Lost Primarchs demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how mystery functions in storytelling. They've provided just enough information to make speculation meaningful, while maintaining enough ambiguity to prevent any single theory from becoming definitive. Each new novel or codex that touches on the Lost Primarchs adds another piece to the puzzle without ever completing the picture, ensuring that the mystery remains fresh and relevant even after decades of accumulated lore. The question of whether the Lost Primarchs are still alive may never be answered definitively, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The mystery serves the story better than any resolution could. A revealed answer, no matter how carefully crafted, would inevitably disappoint some portion of the fan base and eliminate the creative space that the ambiguity currently provides. As long as the question remains open, every fan can have their own answer, their own interpretation of what happened in those dark days of the Great Crusade, when two brothers vanished from history. What we can say with certainty is that the Lost Primarchs existed, that they fell or failed in ways that made their continued existence unacceptable to the Emperor, and that their removal was deemed so sensitive that even the memory of them had to be largely erased. Whether they died on the battlefields of the Rangdan Xenocides, were executed for their failures, imprisoned beneath the palace, or suffered some fate stranger and more disturbing than any we've imagined, they remain absent from the current timeline of the Imperium. Their statues stand empty. Their legions are dispersed or destroyed. Their names are spoken only in whispers, if at all. But absence isn't the same as non-existence. The Lost Primarchs shape the history they're absent from. The grief their brothers carry affects the decisions those Primarchs make. The suppressed memories influence actions in ways the actors themselves may not fully understand. And the possibility, however remote, that one or both might still exist somewhere in the galaxy adds an element of potential to the narrative that keeps the question alive and compelling. If you've made it this far into our exploration of this enduring mystery, I hope you found something valuable in the journey, even if we haven't arrived at a definitive destination. The Lost Primarchs remind us that in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, there is also mystery, tragedy, and the weight of secrets too terrible to be revealed. They embody the cost of ambition, the fragility of perfection, and the sometimes cruel necessities of power. As we continue to explore the Warhammer 40,000 universe together, here on the Obsidian Scriptorium we'll keep investigating these deep mysteries, these fascinating corners of the lore that reveal truths about the setting and about storytelling itself. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mystery of the Lost Primarchs, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Your engagement helps ensure we can continue producing this kind of comprehensive lore content, and it helps other lore enthusiasts discover these videos when they're searching for answers to the same questions you are. Drop your own theories about the Lost Primarchs in the comments below. Do you think they're truly dead? Imprisoned somewhere? Transformed into something unrecognisable? What do you believe happened during the Rangdan Xenocides that led to their removal from history? The mystery is meant to be explored, debated, and interpreted, and your perspectives add to the richness of our community's understanding of this fascinating corner of 40k lore. Until next time, remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, some questions may never be answered, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The Emperor protects, or does he?